All right, welcome to the Policy and Planning Commission meeting for February 10th. Call to order tonight. I'd like to, due to the virtual format of today's meeting, I'd like to start by providing some guidelines. We have participants attending by computer and others who may be attending by phone. For all meeting attendees who wish to speak, please speak clearly and pause frequently. State your name each time before speaking. Mute your microphone when not speaking, and if having technical difficulties, please join the meeting using a different device such as a smartphone or tablet, or the call-in information in the invite. And we're going to go ahead and have two sets of attendance tonight. Kristen, please go ahead and call for PPC, and Lucy for Development Commission.
All right, Commissioner Bader.
Here.
Commissioner Milligan.
Here.
Good to see you. Commissioner Lewis.
Here.
Commissioner Fall.
Here.
Chair Fall. And Commissioner Zaragoza.
Here.
And then Commissioners Voice and Monahan have excused absences this evening.
Good evening, Development Commission. Chair Brennan.
Here.
Commissioner Sanford.
Here.
Commissioner Soa.
Here.
Commissioner Dillon. We'll see if she's having trouble joining. Commissioner Shore. I see it may be having technical issues, so we'll check in with her when she's back. Commissioner Price.
Here.
Commissioner Ikeda. May be also having problems. And Commissioner Morgan.
Here.
And for the Development Commission, I just wanted to let you know that Commissioner Arthur Schulte has submitted his resignation. So he won't be joining us anymore, unfortunately. But now I hope to be able to confirm Commissioner Shore's presence.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Kristen. And then I'm going to go ahead and go through the tonight's agenda and structure. We're going to start off with general public comment, and then we'll have presentations on the code update memo for circulation and for parking. Each topic will stop and have for commissioner questions. We'll open up to public comment again for each topic, and then we'll conclude with commissioner discussion.
Chair Fall. Excuse me, we do need to approve the minutes for January 20th and January 27th first.
Okay. And here. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and approve the meeting minutes for January 20th. Do I hear of any changes or corrections that need to be made for the January 20th meeting minutes? Okay, hearing none. Meeting minutes for January 20th is approved. And the meeting minutes for January 27th, are there any corrections or changes that need to be made to those? Okay, and hearing none, the January 27th meeting minutes are approved as well. And I will go ahead and hand the floor over to Kristen and Lucy for their presentations tonight.
Actually, are you going to do start with public comment as you mentioned
I was just
previously?
about to say that, yes.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and open up for general public comment. Are there
All right.
any members of the public that'd like to speak?
If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand or press *3. There's no one that would like to speak at this time.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to go ahead and hand the floor over to you for presentations.
And that's going to be Stephen Padua.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Kristen, could you give me rights to share my screen? While she does that, thank you, everyone, for having me tonight. My name is Stephen Padua. I'm the long-range planning manager for the city, and I'm going to be going over the parking and circulation sections of Title 18 project update. And these are the last gaps analysis items that will be brought to the commission as we shift our focus into the next phase. You all have done splendid work for the last year to go through several sections, and now we're going to be shifting the focus, looking more specifically at actually draft code changes. Now I have rights. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see my presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So as I was saying, I'm going to be discussing the parking circulation sections of the Title 18 project update. And while we typically have talked about these two topics, kind of the combined topics, they are separate topics. We'll be referencing separately in different code sections that we'll be talking about as I go through the gaps analysis. And due to the nature of the code sections, staff held additional affinity groups discussions, which is a little different than some of the other topics you might have discussed. So on January 5th, we hosted a joint subcommittee meeting with the members of the Economic Vitality Commission and the Transportation Advisory Board. And on January 6th, we facilitated discussion with our Vision Partners group as well as interested property owners. And then on January 18th, we facilitated discussion with several developers and master builders with projects in our areas. And I'll talk a little more about that in the presentation as we go through discussion and getting feedback from you all on these topics. But if you haven't read through the meeting summaries that were part of tonight's materials, I encourage you to do so. Each of the groups had different levels of expertise and experience when it comes to parking and circulation, which made for great conversations with staff. So similar to the other topics that have been brought to the commission, the general approaches for parking and circulation are consistent with several of the project goals, which aim to simplify and streamline code. As we go through each area, staff will incorporate modern best practices and provide level detail that is more appropriate for the land use development process. As part of this process, staff will also look at updating the engineering and similar detailed specifications. That way we maintain long-term consistency with what code requirements are going to be changing to. So as Chair Fall mentioned earlier, we'll be going through each section separately and then stop for discussion with each of the commissions. And I'll be starting with circulation. So you've heard this multiple times before, and it's no different for circulation, but the city has gone through multiple phases of code amendments, which has created multiple layers to the land development process. The general city code was specific and less specific language for circulation design and construction. And then you have added layers of replacement regulations with the central standards with the goal of supporting growth through central Issaquah. Something that's a little more unique to circulation and topics like it is we have the Public Works engineering standards, which provide further guidance on design and construction that kind of come into play during this code update. More recently, the city adopted the Mobility Master Plan, which provides updated policies on where walking and bicycling facilities should be located throughout the city. And this will also influence some of the code update for circulation. So for the circulation section of code, these are the general methods staff are approaching the update. So the Long Range Planning Group will be working closely with Public Works and Park staff to consolidate engineering specifications related to design and construction and items related to safety into the Public Works engineering standards and referencing that in code. Similar to other topics being covered in this project, we'll be consolidating code to simplified sections, and relevant to circulation, we'll be updating the roadways cross sections identified in code to be consistent with the recently adopted plans like the Mobility Master Plan. And that way it's simpler to use in the land development process and easier to enforce. Now, when we had the affinity groups discussions, the topic of circulation did not have as many areas of concern when we were preparing for the meetings. And so the majority of questions focused at the affinity group discussions were on parking, which will be the next topic I'll talk about tonight. But we did still have a general conversation about circulation to make sure that we're not missing any issues or concerns as we go through this project update. All groups agreed that the consolidation and the simplification of code is very important, and many mentioned it was long overdue. Additional comments were made that new code should be aligned with newly adopted city plans like the Mobility Master Plan. And the majority of conversations with the affinity groups focused more on parking, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But this seemed to be an area where both staff and the affinity groups felt that the least amount of issues were involved in the project update process. And as noted in the staff memo in here tonight's materials, items not being addressed as part of the Title 18 update project will be added to the whiteboard, which will be addressed at a future date following the Title 18 project update. For circulation, 2 areas were identified as items that the city will need to address at another time. First is how transit facilities will be designed and enforced in city code. And it's our intention to address this as part of the transit study that the city will be starting this year. The other area that we think we can agree on is how we'll be accommodating high capacity transit like light rail in the city in the future. We have not identified locations of light rail tracks or stations, but once we do, we'll need to address this in code in terms of design and construction, as well as access to transit and land use development around light rail and the stations that get identified. That way we can complement the connected transit service and the development around it. So now I'd like to stop and open the floor for questions or comments about circulation. The main questions we have for you tonight are there concerns or comments related to the consolidation of these documents, the merging of the roadway classifications in code, or potentially alignment with the mobility master plan? And Chair Fall, let me know if you want me to stop sharing my screen for discussion.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead and keep the screen up there, so the members can go ahead and see that for questions. And if you have questions, please ask them in the chat window, and or mention you have a question, and I'll go ahead and call on you. And Nina Milligan has the first question.
Good evening, Stephen. It's fun to be working with you again. The previous slide about future considerations regarding transit facilities. Can you tell me what's the definition of future?
So in the development of the transit study that will be starting this year, we are wanting to identify what the near-term or long-term changes of our transit system should look like to accommodate both our growth as well as the potential, or as the planned light rail that's going to be coming into the city. And so when we look at any potential changes to the system, we want to make sure that it's easier to look at in code how that's going to be accommodated by either new development or in public projects.
I'm sorry, let me follow up for clarity. And then there was another part where you mentioned that there's other stuff that we won't do until after that. When is after that? And can you kind of recap what that involves?
Well, with the development of the transit study, we're going to be looking at kind of what this planned transit network should look like or change to over time. It's hard to say when a specified date is because we can do as much planning as we want, but Sound Transit is the ultimate decider of where light rail will go, and they're not going to be ready for discussion until at least 2028. So we have a few years to start some initial planning and prepare for those discussions, but we really can't make any changes until some of those decisions are decided with Sound Transit and even WashDOT after 2028. Chair Fall, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. We're not supposed to be on mute. And it looks like we have a question from Commissioner Brennan.
Thank you, Chair Paul. Just a quick question. We were talking about consolidation of the design standards and eliminating redundancy. The road profiles and design standards for sidewalk widths, street trees, landscaping requirements, they create character as well for certain parts of the city. Are we talking about kind of merging to kind of a more consistent standard, or are we still going to be preserving the character that comes with the road profiles in different parts of the city, like the Highlands or like Old Town, etc.?
Thank you for the question. So for consolidation with circulation, we are trying to move all the sections of code to just one section of code primarily. For the road classifications or the profiles where it's defined characteristics, that's something we're preserving. That's not something that we're looking to change. The only exception is with the mobility master plan. It defined new policies on where certain walkway or bike facilities should be going in the city. So we'll be updating those roadway profiles to be consistent with the mobility master plan. But the overall characteristics that are defined for neighborhoods is something that we're preserving.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Brennan. And Commissioner Lewis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. Commissioner Joy Lewis here. Thank you for the presentation so far, Stephen. It's nice to have you in your new role. This is the first time you've been presenting to us in your new role, and it's a very fitting one for you to be in front of us for. My only comment on this section is really, as we consolidate these documents into a single code, I feel like I sit from a very unique position. As somebody who used to sit on the UVDC, I'm very familiar with moonroofs, for instance, in the Highlands, the parking requirements of Talus. Not everybody is. And we also, from the Planning Policy Commission standpoint, we have a lot of policy that has gone into things like creating what you will now be pulling into code from, for instance, bike racks, right? And having the availability of bike parking. So when we come at this few of us, we see a lot of it. I think it's going to be very difficult from somebody from the outside and members of the public to necessarily be reading the code and having it make sense. And I would just encourage that when we do see draft documents, that it very clearly lays out, here's what the policies are, here's what we've had, and this is why we're merging it. Similar to the way that our documents are kind of broken down for us with a gaps analysis, but really having a bit of a background so that when people are able to dive into the code, it makes a little bit more sense. So that's my only comment really, is as we see it next time, to kind of taking a little more painstaking effort to really see how the sauce is made, for instance, to be able to say, this is why this makes sense. It's because I'm able to pull this from these different places to get our end result. So that's my only encouragement on this particular section. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lewis. I'm not seeing any additional questions. So, Kristen, let's go ahead and open it up for public comment on this topic.
I apologize. I'm here. I was having trouble seeing my list. It looks like Connie Morris would like to speak. Connie Morris. Connie, I am making you a panelist, and you may speak. You are unmuted. You can turn on your camera.
Okay. Start my video. There we go. Got it. So it's good to know you've forgotten my name. That's always nice. I'm Connie Marsh. I live up on Squawk. And so consolidation into one area so that you can see it, of course, makes sense. But the problems that you're outlining that I guess you're trying to fix are not the problems that I have with the road standards and circulation. So I'm going to tell you what they are, and maybe you're going to fix them somewhere else. And that is one, we have had huge difficulties with the private sector building to the public roads, and there is no particular public process for a community to input into that project effectively. When it goes to Development Commission, we say it's outside of their purview. This is not something that the Transportation Advisory Board considers, and so that basically leaves the community out of their own roads projects and the details that they will live with every single day when they are driving their cars around those projects. So that is a huge problem that does not seem to be being addressed here. And similarly, our public roads are considered not zoned, and so they have very few rules for how they have to go through any sort of process within Title 18 or any of our code, because they are not considered zoned. And so this leaves the building of public roads and public facilities just sort of out there in the wind, and they use a toolkit that is going to be reviewed, but it's not effective. And so the public has no consistency. We have no idea how these roads projects go through publicly and privately. And so then what happens is when the community finally gets their hands on a roads project, we're really testy. And then, staff gets defensive and we get grumpy and it's ugly. So I would like to solve that nut in some much more elegant and effective way. And I don't know what that is, but that's a big nut to crack for me. And then the other one that we've had issues with is that whole thing about when can you not use the standards? And I don't care what the standards are, but sometimes I want to keep the mature tree. I don't want you to cut down the tree so then you can build a planter strip, right? That makes no sense to me. So what types of languages are you going to use or change, or what criteria are you going to use to decide when you don't have to build your roads or mobility facilities to standard? So those are my two big issues that I would like to see solved with this code update. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? No one else is raising their hand to speak.
All right. So I am going to go ahead and open this up for commissioner discussion. And are there any commissioners that would like to make comments? Okay, and the first comment is from Mel Morgan. Commissioner Morgan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. I would like to say that I would agree with all the steps that are being taken, and I think it would be a great idea to have this all in one place, that a developer can fully understand what the needs are, and including if there is a way for any kind of variance to these. We saw a need for big a variance when we had a project, the Brown Bear Car Wash project last week, and a variance to the road standards. It wasn't ours to approve, but it made sense to do it. So again, agree with what staff's doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Morgan. And Commissioner Milligan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. Commissioner Milligan here. And I too echo Commissioner Morgan's comments. I really appreciate the work that's been done, and have really very little complaint. I think we're on the right track, and there's been a lot of good expertise applied to these programs and this project. I'm looking forward to seeing the outcome of how these things get consolidated. I'm sure there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, so we're going to be delighted with the results. I wanted to follow up a little bit with Mr. Padua about preparing for and the timing of dealing with sound transit. And we might have more to talk about in parking, but generally speaking, because of the way it was introduced before, is that it seems that we have some things that we could do in advance of sound transit telling us what to do that will help chart a stronger course for our Issaquah's desires and what's important to us rather than what's important to sound transit. Being at the end of the line, we all know that this is a challenge, and in fact, it was Mr. Padua who took me to Redmond to learn about how their forward planning helped to prevent sound transit from taking over areas of the city for their facilities that Redmond did not want them to take over. So I hope that we don't have just a blanket statement saying, hey, we'll just do that later. I think we can see what's coming, and I'd like to move some of that up earlier. I think that's just my main comment about circulation, though I do want to follow up on what Connie Marsh said about standards and road standards. We're going to talk about this again later with street parking, but it is, I'd like to learn more, and I hope that we will in the next presentation about what are the standards in our street right-of-way use for our circulation and parking, that we might need more standards that might be able to be held till the next section. So thank you, Chair Fall.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. And not seeing any additional comments. I would like to second what Nina and Mel Morgan has said, specifically about the parking, and to Connie's point, I think is also very important about the street standards. So Stephen, do you feel comfortable speaking to some of Connie's questions?
Yes, so we'll go back to my notes from public comment.
Yeah, I can try and start, Stephen, and then maybe you can fall in. So what I heard, Chair Fall, were we need a process for roads, public and private, when I'm assuming these are things that don't go through, don't have an associated land use permit that is approved by a development commission or has a public process built into it. So if it's a standalone road or an access point, that there needs to be some thoughtful process and public engagement process for that. The other thing I think was a more robust and clear and transparent process for deviations from adopted standards for street frontage, and having some guidance for if what that deviation process looks like, who makes the decision, but also what criteria is used for granting those deviations. So I think that those were good things that we would take back in terms of as we draft our code to keep that in that filter as we're going through a rewrite process.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Minnie. Okay, I am not seeing additional comments, so we're going to go ahead and bring it back to Stephen for the next section.
So there's one additional question I actually want to pose to the Development Commission on the topic of circulation, because it's been a topic of discussion among staff with through block passages, and I apologize I didn't have that added on my presentation. But the question is with the relevance of having through block passages specific to Central Issaquah or citywide, because right now the standards are not very clear on where it should be required to have through block passages and when it shouldn't. Similar to what was the comments that were made in public comment of not having the right detail of when you're not supposed to have something constructed. And right now we have through block passages being required in locations where it doesn't seem to make sense, where you connect a road to an alleyway, or you connect a road to a private walkway, and it's not publicly accessible. So I'm hoping to get a little bit of maybe feedback from the Development Commission on kind of your experience with seeing projects as they've come through to you when it comes to the requirements of through block passages.
Okay, and it looks like we have a comment from Commissioner Sanford.
Thank you, Chair Fall. This is Richard Sanford. To the through block passage point, I know that when we were participating in drafting the architecture and urban design standards for Central Issaquah, the context there was really in reference to a grid. And we were discussing the utility and the effectiveness of through block passages in the context of that grid. Where that's producible in the city, I think the concept of through block passage makes sense. But as you say, as you move out of that context, it makes less sense, frankly. And I think there is even a possible problem that could be encountered with a development that's out of that kind of context. Does that mean that the next development that may be next to it must maintain that through block passage if it's not a clearly defined grid? So that's the kind of question that occurs to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner Sanford. And Commissioner Milligan, you have the floor.
Hi, Commissioner, Planning Policy Commissioner here. You didn't ask for me, but having spent years on the Urban Village Development Commission, I too dealt with through block passages quite a bit, and I wanted to chime in my support for them in general, especially as they were implemented in Issaquah Highlands. They were a really important tool to help reduce massing and the pedestrian circulation up in Issaquah Highlands depends on these through block passages. Now, maybe to what Commissioner Soa is saying is that, and perhaps we already have it in Issaquah Highlands, and that could be a model, is that our through block passage facilities are all different size and scale depending on where they are. So if you're just trying to break up a residential block and it's not really a grid, you just want to keep access to, say, that alley, the little sneaker sidewalk is great and really important to encourage efficient pedestrian circulation. So I encourage you to perhaps consider the Issaquah Highlands standards for through block passages and then improve them as necessary, because I know that we have learned from them as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. And Commissioner Morgan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. I'd like to echo what Commissioner Sanford said about the grid through block passages versus what we see in some locations. And I have to say the Development Commission has not worked on the Highlands, so we didn't get to see that kind of ground up development work there. But I think we did have an example, if I remember correctly, with the Issaquah Work Lofts project, with a question about a through block passage in that parcel that would have taken you to, if I remember right, just the freeway right of way, or it seemed like a questionable location. It would seem that there should be a requirement in general that any through block passage has to have reasonable endpoints at both sides before you would require it in a location. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Morgan. And Commissioner Lewis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. Commissioner Joy Lewis, I just wanted to voice support and echo Nina's comments about through block passages. I think they're right on point for how I feel. And I will say that when we get on later to parking requirements, one of the affinity groups did mention distinguishing Old Town separately in the parking requirements. And I think that would be an appropriate thing to do here for through block passages and be able to expand them throughout the city. And if staff feels it is reasonable to create a small designated zone where they don't exist, would be the exception for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lewis. Commissioner Zaragoza.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. Richard Zaragoza. So I just wanted to second Nina's comments on the Highlands and those pass-throughs. Those are really great, and they're really functional when you're dealing with row homes, which are long, kind of like going on for an entire block, and you really want to just kind of get to the other side of the street. They also have, they really create a feeling of a village, right? You have these little passageways, which are almost like little private sidewalks. They really have a great feeling for those neighborhoods. But it is a complex situation. I think we need a good list of what the reasons for them are, what the goals are, how they help in certain. I mean, because I think they do create different things in different situations and different types of neighborhoods. So I think the rules for how they work needs to be a little bit more dynamic. But yeah, I definitely wouldn't want to just say, oh, they're not necessarily outside of these zones, but really kind of think about how they can affect every type of zone in the city. So they can be really great. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Zaragoza. And Commissioner Brennan, go ahead.
I agree with Commissioner Zaragoza's comment about there needs to be clarity about what's the purpose that the through block passage is providing. I agree with the comments from other commissioners about there needs to be a destination. They need to be taking you somewhere. And the context, whether it's in a residential, smaller scale, single family residential zone, or a commercial like in the central Issaquah area, then there's a different context, and so their purpose is different. So if you're if part of the purpose is to break up the block from a pedestrian experience, so you don't have long uninterrupted blocks that people need to travel, you have an opportunity to break the block up to provide some additional options to get to where you want to go using the through block passages. They also break up, as somebody mentioned, the massing of a building. But there are other ways to break up the massing of the building too, by limiting floor plate sizes and requiring certain step backs, etc. But I think it needs to be clear in the code, and I haven't looked at the specific code language here, about what the underlying purpose of the through block passage is, to make sure you don't end up with something that just doesn't, like you said in the presentation or in the question, where it doesn't make sense. It runs you, it dead ends at a freeway. I mean, that wouldn't make any sense. So again, I think that would be my suggestion, is that clarity about purpose, and then the context on which area of the city it's in, and then that would determine the configuration.
Thank you, Commissioner Brennan. Commissioner Milligan.
This is Commissioner Milligan. Such a good topic. I have to come in twice. Listening to our fellow commissioners, I'm reminded of one circumstance that I thought I should have brought up, is that the through block passage is often on private property and it's a public facility. And I think that this has been a real bugger. I don't know the solution, but I just want to bring that up as one of those challenges that I wish we could solve for, because I really do think that they are so highly valuable. And echoing what our other commissioners have said, that when it facilitates pedestrian circulation or bicycle circulation, where those are allowed, I think that they're invaluable and in any area in the city. But I do think that one little issue of liability, not little, could maybe be addressed a little better. Maybe we could do that in the code. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. And I'd like to second Commissioner Milligan's point and bring up Atlas as a great example of where that might be a failure. Okay, I am not seeing any additional comments or questions. So with that said, Planner Padua, do you want to go ahead and move on to the next topic?
Yes, thank you. Before I move on, and I first thank you for kind of the off-the-cuff question on through block passages. And there was one more comment made in public comment on the street standards. And one of the things that one of the extra efforts we're kind of going through in addition to the Title 18 update is updating the public works street standards. So that's something that staff is actually undergoing right now, because it's completely understandable if we're going to be referencing these street standards in code, they need to be up to date too, because they haven't been updated since 2010, which is well overdue on needing to get updated. So that is all something that's getting updated as part of this process too, just to go back to Chair Fall, your ask of kind of addressing the comments that were made in public comment.
Thank you very much for doing that. I appreciate it.
So moving on to parking. So thank you again for the comments on circulation. Now we'll move on to the parking section of code. Similar to circulation, there's multiple layers being considered with this project update. You have the guidance. You have layers of code and guidance that have created kind of a confusing process for the land development. It's difficult to manage and enforce for staff. So we'll be looking at the guidance for the mobility master plan, as well as 2 major parking studies the city has undergone the last few years to help guide some of these changes, but also look at intention to stick to current policy. Because if there's areas where staff feel like there's a deviation from the original regulation intent, we'll be bringing those topics back to the commission for further discussion before any changes get pursued. So for parking, there's a large amount of work being consolidated code to streamline in the land use development process. And based on staff and Affinity group discussions, we'll be taking a closer look at several of the areas of the parking code. The first is with parking occupancy metrics. For this code language, staff will be looking at all the different metrics we use to determine how we can consolidate and simplify these metrics. Because right now we have several metrics that we use to determine parking regulation that are inconsistent and extremely difficult to regulate and predict. So we want to simplify this for staff, but also for anyone using the code to understand what we're actually trying to require. We'll also be looking at improvements to code language related to requirements of the transportation management plans and when these are required and what's required. Right now, we say the transportation management plans are required, but we don't provide enough detail of what exactly we're requiring and when. So we want to provide clarity in this language on what we mean by requiring these transportation management plans and what this achieves. Staff will also be looking at establishing contextual parking requirements based on land use. This would be something that would create tiers or buckets of parking regulation for different areas of the city. So, one of the examples that was mentioned in the staff memo was looking at maybe Central Issaquah and Old Town as the same bucket. Commissioner Lewis, you brought up a good point with the Affinity group discussions of maybe that's not the best idea. And so we're looking at how best to use that if it's useful in this title update process. And so that'll be another topic we'll bring back to the discussion in the next phase. Additionally, staff will be adding more bike parking, more language on bike parking and shared parking to clarify what exactly the city is requiring, because we provide some description in the central standards, but it doesn't really differentiate between short-term and long-term bike parking and what incentives we're actually allowing as part of what would be going into the bike parking standards. And so we want to take advantage of this process to really make it clear what incentives we're providing, as well as additional tools that relate to these items that meets the original intent of the requirements. So as I noted before, parking had the most topic areas of concern and interest for staff and the affinity groups. There's mixed opinion about minimum and maximum parking requirements, as well as any changes to bike parking requirements. All the groups agreed that the parking occupancy metrics should be simplified, but more detail needs to be provided for bike parking requirements and incentives related to transit access. And
Steven?
lastly, yes.
Let me interrupt you. I'm not seeing anything on my screen.
Oh.
Commissioner Milligan, is he showing something on your screen?
It's showing now.
Okay.
I apologize for that. I pressed share and it didn't actually go through. So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So going back to what I was saying with the detail needed for bike parking and transit access incentives, we want to make sure that we are meeting the intent of what was called for in the Central Issaquah plan, as well as newly adopted plans and making new policy changes related to that. And the city needs to look at its requirements related to parking structures. A lot of concern has been expressed with how much parking is being required within a parking structure in Central Issaquah, and meeting city goals related to affordable housing and being able to achieve both. And so one of the things we will want to try to look at is how can we clarify these parking structure requirements or potentially make changes. And that's something more specifically we'll bring in the next phase with the commission. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier with the whiteboard is that we're not able to address everything as part of this Title 18 project update. You're probably seeing that consistent with a lot of other sections. And so a lot of items from the Affinity group discussions are being added to the whiteboard. Most of these items will require major amendments that will result in significant different outcomes. And so staff did not feel that it was appropriate to address a lot of these at this time, which is why they're on the whiteboard list. So based on the Affinity group discussions, the topics highlighted in bold on this list will likely be the prioritized topics the city will want to address sooner than later. So now I'd like to stop and ask if there's any questions or comments for the parking section of code. There's a lot of areas of update that the city will want to pursue as part of this project. And there's a lot of updates the city is wanting to hold off on until after the Title 18 code update. Currently, I have all the approaches changes listed on the screen, but if you'd like me to move to another slide, please let me know.
And thank you very much, Planner Padua. And so we're going to go ahead and open up to commissioner questions. And the first one is Commissioner Sanford.
Thank you, Chair Fall. It's Richard Sanford. I notice in the parking section under the parking memo, I guess it's page 22 of 51, it lays out a bulleted list of the various aspects of this activity that can improve the effectiveness and so on. And one is clarifying which standards apply citywide and which apply only to specific geographic locations. And it reminded me of when we were talking about the architecture and urban design aspects of the code update a little while ago. And there was a citywide section that was being considered there, as well as neighborhood overlay section. So it seems that there are going to be aspects of this code that are specific, if not to neighborhoods, then to certain geographic areas, and different tiers are being discussed. So I was wondering if you're thinking of structuring this in the same way with a citywide section and neighborhood overlay section, or if there's not that much information in terms of architecture and urban design. It was highly substantive, and there was going to be a lot of information in both of those. I was wondering if you're considering the same approach for this. I guess my opinion would be I would only caution if there is substantive amount of information, if it can be structured similarly to the approach in the architecture and urban design areas, so that I think that would be the most intuitive for users. Thanks.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Sanford. To answer your question, yes, we are wanting to simplify this as much as possible. Very similar to the design standards, where we'll have a table and we'll just have currently, you know, when you look at the table for parking regulations, you have the column of where the land use is and the column for what the parking requirement is. If we look at how to incorporate this in more of a context-based regulation, where maybe it's regulation for central or another area for trying to meet this similar intent, you'll have just that another column identifying for that other tier what that parking regulation would be.
Okay, so it sounds like it's not going to be parallel to the architecture and urban design, which had entirely different sections for citywide versus neighborhood overlays. It sounds like there's not that same level of substantive information here, and it could be handled in a table.
It is in the context where we're explaining what the intent is between the different sections, not so much in the table that will be provided in code.
Okay, and thank you very much, Commissioner Sanford. Commissioner Lewis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. Commissioner Joy Lewis. Stephen, do you mind going back to the previous slide? My question's a little bit broad right now, and I'm hoping to better understand for this particular section of the code, how much we're changing versus doing a consolidation clarifying. Are we still planning on using the basic core structure of what we require for structured parking, for instance, right now for this Title 18 overhaul, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Correct. Yeah.
And that's a future discussion. Do you happen to know, Minnie may know better, or Kristen, since she was here, the last time that our commission looked at this, I think was about 3 years ago that we did structured parking. But I'm curious if we're planning on simplifying, consolidating, but yet also keeping the core tenets of the existing code when it pertains to structured parking.
For the intent of this project, we're preserving all the regulations as much as we can. The what's identified on the whiteboard list will be items that we'll be addressing after the Title 18 update project, the current project anyway. Kristen, do you have any insight on the first question?
I just want to note the structured parking was updated as part of the 2016 moratorium and was adopted in 2017.
Okay, thank you. That aligns to what I was remembering. And then can you also walk me through something that was interesting in the affinity groups was this discussion about the use of public parking, for instance, along public streets for private enterprises. Can you go a little bit more into that discussion and kind of what staff is thinking about that?
Could you clarify which?
The off-street parking requirements right now is on a whiteboard, but it was discussed pretty heavily with all the affinity groups. They all weighed in pretty well on this. I was kind of curious if staff could kind of speak to us a little bit.
Yes, thank you for the question. So in the discussion with the affinity groups, we brought up on-street parking versus off-street parking and the type of requirements that should be considered in city code. And what was brought up in the affinity groups is in the newer developments where we're requiring off-street parking as part of the building or in the structure, they're not being used, and it's forcing people, or people are choosing to park on the street. And so several of the comments that were made with this kind of future discussion on the regulations of what they should be is we need to be considering incentives or another tool that incorporates on-street parking as part of the broader context of what's being provided for new developments. And so when we eventually have that discussion, we'll be looking at for off-street parking, what should the requirement be? So going to that second bullet point of should we be moving to parking maximums with certain areas of the city, as well as looking at with structured parking, how can we meet affordable housing goals and balance that with trying to keep with the original intent of the parking structure requirements, which was aesthetics as well as making sure we have a pedestrian friendly environment.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I certainly felt like when I was looking at the different comments from the affinity groups, I was missing a particular group, and that was really neighborhood community involvement. Really seeing how we're using our spaces, how people feel that they're being impacted by parking was a little bit absent from those conversations. And I want to encourage that when we're having this conversation about off-street parking, that we're able to hopefully have a community manager in place at that point and be able to really be having a better feel for what's going on. You had mentioned earlier about how we're going to be using previous parking studies when moving forward right now with our Title 18 for this section. And I certainly remember that we were surprised as a commission at some of the results from the parking study, and that they didn't necessarily reflect the comments that were coming in from the community. We also, I remember the parking study coming in and telling us particular numbers about, what was full, what was being used, and what wasn't, and but what was remarkably not included in that was how the transit center was at capacity, by what time, how full, how often was that being utilized, and how many people were being turned away and things like that. And so there was an entire component that was missing from those surveys that we would really get again from the people who are using the facilities. And so I'm not quite sure how that plays in moving forward for us right now, but it does leave a little bit of a concern to me that we're missing a pie wedge, if that makes sense. I've really enjoyed reading the discussions of the affinity groups. I found it incredibly helpful when looking at this topic, but I do want to say that I think that there's a little bit more that needs to go in before we start doing our draft code as we kind of retool things around. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner Lewis. And I also would like to bring up a question here. But before I do, I notice that Commissioner Milligan wants to bring up a point of order.
Hi, thank you, Chair Fall. Commissioner Milligan here. I didn't want to get in the way of your question, but I wanted to make a suggestion that after we finish our questions and we have public comment, and then we go into commissioner deliberations, can the staff help us by either using the affinity group slide or one of the things that breaks up the topics so that we don't feel like we have to comment about all of the things at one time, so that we can listen to the other comments about bike parking or listen to the other comments about street parking or maximums or whatever it is. If you could just break it up into 3 or 4 for us, I think we could be more efficient in listening and kind of putting together our thoughts, if that's possible. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Fall.
Sure, no worries. Planner Padua, are we actually going to have a presentation on the affinity groups? Because I didn't think we were going to have that tonight, but I know that was in our packet for us to view.
Just the high level summary of when we had the affinity groups and kind of sprinkled information throughout the presentation of what the affinity groups kind of spoke to on each of the topics.
Okay, excellent. I do. So going back to my question here, looking back at what some of the comments were about the affinity groups in regards to bicycle parking, I'm not seeing. In one of the questions here on question 2, it said several comments were made that the city's language should allow flexibility in how developers meet the requirements. Prescriptive language prevents innovation in this area. If we don't offer prescriptive direction, we won't get bicycle parking. And that's been pretty consistent. I've seen in developments where if they don't require it, they don't get it. Now, the demographic of the affinity groups, I don't want to stereotype, but I'm looking and I know most of them, they are not bicyclists. And if you look at a lot of my neighbors who are bicyclists, they're getting e-bikes and they want to use their e-bikes to go back and forth to the stores, and they want a place to lock them up, and there is no place to lock them up. So if we want to get people out of their cars and into alternative modes of transportation, including low-income housing, and not just low-income housing, but high-income luxury apartments as well, people want to use a bicycle, especially if it's an e-bike, because they're easier to use than cars, and they're cheaper, and they're sometimes even faster. So I think it would be misleading for us and destructive for us to allow developers to kind of get away with whatever they want, because if we're not descriptive in it, we're not going to get it. And so I worry that we need to move that component up into what is going to be part of Title 18 and not push it out. Okay. And so with that said, let's go ahead and move it into public comment. Actually, that was probably more of a discussion than it was a question. So let me rephrase that question. So Planner Padua, is that something that we can move up into, and not move it out? Is that something we can move up into the higher priority?
In terms of changing what the requirements are?
Not just changing the requirements, making sure that they stick, because I don't want the way the presentation was to me and the way that I'm seeing the comments is that it's going to get tabled out and kind of moved down in priority.
I see. So what's going to happen with the current update with this Title 18 update project is we're going to be clarifying what's required and keeping the requirements as they stand now. What's on the whiteboard right now is discussion of if we change what the requirements are. So that's not what we're trying to do. And specific to the Affinity Group discussions on their comments on giving developers flexibility, it was more on not going too prescriptive with any additional requirements. For instance, requiring they use a specific type of steel. That was one of the comments developers made, that they've seen a city do that before, or a requirement that they have to use specific shapes where only very few or limited manufacturers actually accommodate that type of requirement. And so that's where they're wanting to be a little more flexible, is making sure that we're providing bike parking that's actually accommodating people who ride bikes. And that's something that I will be making sure is in the code, but also making sure that they have the flexibility to put in the amount or the design of bike parking to fit in kind of with the design of the development that kind of goes in. Does that help kind of address your question?
That does. The way it was presented made it sound like we're going to kind of negotiate it out.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and open it up to public comment. So Kristen, is there any members of the public that would like to make comments tonight on this topic?
Yes, Connie Marsh would like to speak. Connie, you are now a panelist. You may turn on your camera.
Unmute. Start video. Start my video. Okay, so parking. This conversation just feels like it's losing a bunch of history of why our parking is what it is, and so sort of how we got to be where we are, right? So I guess it all boils down to again, neighborhood character. So when you cluster your parking together, that is also clustering the landscaping within the parking. I don't know what that means, because our varying parking characteristics for landscaping are different. So I'm not sure if you're how much melding there is, because I think you have to be very careful not to lose characteristics. There's that one horrifying characteristic, I think, in the central Issaquah plan that says you actually don't have to have any trees. You can just use metal vertical structures instead of trees in a parking lot. I think that's still in there. I would hate to see that spread anywhere. But then there is circulation within parking, which we have many problems in town that you can't walk in or out of elderly shopping centers because there are no sidewalks going in or out. So everybody ends up in the lane of traffic. And this goes back to when do you need to bring things up to standard? So I think some of these circulation within parking lots should be a top criteria for bringing things up to standard, because I would rate things like safety as a priority to consider for whether you are creating a successful parking area. And I think most of our parking standards in Issaquah do not necessarily create successful parking areas. And so I know I am not following your grid because I don't experience parking like you're trying to make me experience it right here. Central Issaquah plan very clearly in its EIS required structured parking because the main reason they convinced us to have the Central Issaquah plan is to get rid of the sea of parking. And to do that, you require structured parking, and we're supposed to be aiming more and more toward that as we go. What I am finding in a lot of the parking areas is each store now has a sign saying what their parking is or is not. Now, if we talk about how we want our parking to look in the city of Issaquah, do we want every store to have their own individual parking, or are we trying to figure out some more holistic parking system? Our comprehensive plan says we're supposed to try to figure out how to make a holistic system. So we don't have that at this point in time. I think you need to include something about that in our code. And then when you talk about parking management, we actually have language in the comprehensive plan about parking management. And some of the times that we don't, we find ourselves short on parking and it becomes an issue is because we have known functions that happen all the time, like at the school district in a variety of places. And so we need to have some management strategies to work in special events. Because if every Tuesday night you have a special event in Old Town, and then all of the street parking in the neighborhoods is taken up by a special event, this is an issue that could be resolved by trying to have some parking management. And we have just ignored that throughout time. And I think we need to actually bring that to the fore and try to figure out how to manage things a little better. And we actually already have it as a language to try to guide us there. And so I don't think that has to be on a whiteboard. And I think I saw that on a whiteboard. And then I want to talk about another overlap. We're going to talk about safety and lighting in parking. And so right now, in Old Town, we have public parking with zero lighting. And so I think we need to have lighting standards that are in our public areas as well as private areas. So the city, again, needs to start to adhere to some new standards. And right now, we don't really have public parking standards like that for our own city. So how do we get those into our code? This is more of how I experience parking around town and how I fight trying to get to certain stores where it's particularly unsafe. And so if you don't mind feeding those things into the hopper as you address code and potentially walk around town and see where you feel unsafe. And then one last thing, I was the person who was trying to get a through block passage that the Development Commission considered dead ending to the freeway, but it wasn't. It is trying to make a parallel passage to Gilman Boulevard, which is particularly awful to walk on. So some consideration needs to be for that criteria is where are the safe, pleasant places for people to walk and how do we create those corridors? So sorry, I just went back a topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? If so, please raise your hand. There's no one else who would like to speak.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. And so let's go ahead and open it back up to commissioner discussion. Are there any commissioners that would like to make some discussion points? I know there is. Commissioner Sanford, you are the first one, please.
Thanks, Chair Fall. Richard Sanford. Question. What's the scope of input that you would like from a Development Commission on this tonight? It seems that some of the affinity group comments concern topics that wound up on the whiteboard. And so I guess discussion of whiteboard items is not part of our discussion tonight. Is that correct? And you really want us to focus on the elements of structuring the code, or is it open for us to comment on the affinity group comment topics as well?
I think tonight it'd be helpful to get comments on, and I'll share my screen to go back to the specific areas where we're kind of approaching this project as part of the Title 18 update project. Is it helpful to have this? This is the kind of the specific areas. And I can go back to Commissioner Milligan's comments of maybe we bundle this up in, groups of 3 to help with kind of consolidate or organize commissioner comments. Chair Fall, does that work to kind of go that for commissioner discussions?
I think that would be a great idea.
Okay, so I can leave the screen up, and then for the first 3 comments, Commissioner Sanford, to answer your question, it would be helpful to get your commissioner thoughts on items even on the whiteboard, even if we aren't going to be addressing that as part of this project. Because one of the things that we do want to try to look at with the items on the whiteboard is how to prioritize those topics following the Title 18 update project.
Okay, thanks. And so in that case, I'll throw this one out because I want to make sure this doesn't get lost. It does relate to some topics that were raised by the affinity groups. And I noticed that there was concern about structured parking in terms of the high water table, building separate structured parking below ground. And Ms. Marsh just referred to, are we going to require every development, every store and so on to have their own parking plan and their own structured parking? I was wondering, I haven't seen much discussion of municipal parking and our plans for municipal structured parking or parking lots. And I guess I could envision a kind of healthy context in which the city provides municipal parking that's fairly close to areas of high concentration or interest, quarter-mile walking distance, let's say, and not necessarily next to the high-density area of interest, but a bit farther away, with a walk toward that, a pedestrian-friendly, retail-friendly area that could be very conducive, I think, to retail, because it would all be first floor, it would be street level. Another issue with it seems to me, requiring structured parking, if we can't go below the building very far down to the water table, a lot of the structured parking may be above ground, and then the building winds up hovering above the parking. And that defeats the purpose of having an engaging first floor public realm that is retail friendly. So maybe in terms of this kind of municipal idea that I'm suggesting, maybe developers could pay into a parking fund that would, the purpose of which would be to construct and maintain municipal parking in the areas where I just identified. Thanks. Just want to throw that out there.
Thank you, Commissioner Sanford. One quick comment to Commissioner Sanford. I just thought of the idea, maybe above ground parking above the building. So instead of having just a bare roof, you have parking on the roof. And then taking the Target example, or in the Safeway mall example, instead of having all this expansive parking, you put the parking on top of the building, and then people can take an elevator or stairs down into the building itself, and that would save space and solve the problem. Okay, the next comment here is from Commissioner Milligan. You have the floor. Oh, you're on mute.
Commissioner Morgan is ahead of me. I want to hear what he has to say.
Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Morgan. I highlighted you and I went right over you. Go ahead and you have the floor.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Chair Fall. A few comments then. I would agree with consolidation of the documents, consolidation of off-street parking requirements, and simplifying the parking occupancy metrics. All those, I think, make great sense. The transportation management plan criteria, I would simply throw those out. I feel like those fall in the herding cat management plan category, in that the idea that we can set up these plans that the city can monitor, that property owners can put in place for employers to try to get their employees to follow through on, I think is far more work than we ever would get results from, and not make that part of the requirement for developing property to have those. I just don't think they're workable. I do agree with the contextual parking requirements, and as stated by Commissioner Lewis, that those may need to be separated, say, between Central Issaquah and Old Town or whatever areas we want those in. Let's see, there was one other thing I don't think was, oh, no, it is at the end here, the shared parking. I think it's critical to look at updating the shared parking code language to see how those can change. We're involved in a project. Our fund owns the Maple Street building that used to have parking on the south side of Maple Street that was an open sea of parking. We sold it to our partner to build a hotel, the Spring Hill Suites Hotel, and we have a shared parking agreement so they can use our parking stalls at night for hotel guests. We can use our parking garage during the day for our office tenants. And it works great, and it's a great way to get more use out of parking. And so I think to the extent that we can look at those shared parking agreements, that language, and make sure it works now, but also giving that flexibility as parking requirements might change down the road for those agreements to be revised. The bike parking, I think it's critical that we do look at that we do want to encourage bikers to have parking available. One thing I would like you to look at is the possibility of ground floor retail space in buildings to be used for bike parking facilities in the interim period, because as we try to put ground floor retail, especially in the Central Issaquah area, trying to put ground floor retail, it sometimes isn't feasible initially, but it could be used for parking of bike parking or bike storage facilities that still are it activates that area until the point where the retail would be usable. The structured parking, I think that's a must that we continue to look at having that. As Ms. Marsh pointed out, that was something that was integral in the Central Issaquah plan. I served on that task force, and if I remember correctly, at the time, 70% of the Central Issaquah area of the developable land was made up of parking lots. And that was something that would have to change for Central Issaquah to develop. And we can't do that with big fields of parking. So I think we still need structured parking. And finally, I would say that if there's a tool to make it possible for the city to continually change parking requirements on a more frequent basis, it would be good, because I think a lot of if we get autonomous vehicles working more frequently, there's going to be fewer people driving their cars to work. There'd be more people that will take an autonomous car to work, get dropped off, and they don't need to park there. So I think if we have a tool to change frequently, it'd be good. So sorry for the extended comment, and thank you very much, Nina.
Thank you, Commissioner Morgan. And Commissioner Milligan, go ahead.
Well, it's always a pleasure to go after you because you take care of so much topic for me, Commissioner Morgan. Commissioner Milligan here. I'm going to because I have so much to say, I'm going to try to stick to just the top topics on the upper topics on this list. Although it's not so tidy, you know, the way these things all interact with one another. I want to address and maybe Stephen, can you pull up that whiteboard list? Thank you. One of the things that I want to make sure doesn't end up on this list is how we handle street parking. I want to echo Commissioner Lewis's comments about the parking study that we had a few years ago. I too was a little incredulous at the results because they weren't reflecting the experiences our communities were having, our neighborhoods were having. And that was, that was a few years ago. Because this kind of planning is so long ranging, let's fast forward to times when the city is much bigger and there's more issues, more transit facilities available to us, and all the other things that are going to change the way that we use parking. And I really want to assert the importance that I feel for us to address street parking. And you guys are going to know how to do it better, but some of the things that come across my mind are how we allocate street parking to private uses. It hasn't ever quite felt right. So if there is, as we're consolidating, if there's code in the city where that works better, let's use that one. Consolidating is going to be changing our code in some ways, because you're not just going to mishmash everything together. In some cases, you're going to say, hey, this one works well, let's use that way. Let's consolidate to that. And so this would be one circumstance where I think that we could improve, pick the best one. But street parking without controls, as we increase in housing density, transit facilities, and other things, is just causing an unfair allocation of the use. And I'm going to bring up again how much I want to tackle this earlier rather than later, because we are and will be even a bigger end unit for transit for all of East King County, and for us to find a fair way for our parking to be used by residents and businesses rather than a parking lot for people from East King County to get on transit. I really want to tackle that earlier rather than later. Don't want it on a whiteboard. Oh gosh, let me +1 on Commissioner Sanford's comments about municipal parking. Everything that he said is golden. Not only do I think that our city can support economic development in our city by municipal parking, and perhaps over the long term find a way for it not to cost us a bunch of money, but can be a resource that pays for itself or in some way, but to facilitate short distance walking in our retail districts is brilliant. Love that. Thank you. And I have been supportive of municipal parking, which we haven't done, and I'd really like us to do it. We have for a long time and don't know why we don't. Maybe there's something in the code that keeps us from doing that. And let's see, another thing about, just give me a moment, I'm sorry. I wanted to point to Mercer Island as an example of a city that has tried different things over time to make sure that its street and public parking is for the intended uses. For instance, they have suffered from being a transit destination, and so in order to prevent their streets from being commuter parking lots, they would restrict parking up until, say, 9 a.m. And that way, if you are trying to use our city to park your car to take a bus to Bellevue or to take a train to Bellevue or Seattle, that way we could have our streets available for our businesses and the people who live here. Something like that. They have had really great programs, and they have all evolved over the years. And then The last thing I want to mention is I hope there's nothing in our code that prevents us from being creative in the way that we use our street right-of-way for parking by putting the street on a diet. I know this is silly. We all talk about this. See, we've got these big, like 4-lane roads with this turn lane down the middle that somebody uses every once in a while at an intersection. And then we have parallel parking. We can get a lot more parking in some places where we want the street to be on a diet. Maybe we want the street to slow down. And those very local destination streets could use angle parking or some other configuration of parking that allows for more parking and more pedestrian use and slower speeds. I hope that we have that kind of flexibility in our code going forward so we can look at that where it's appropriate. The rest of my comments, I think, are about bikes, so I'll wait. And then, but let me say that the comments that I'm making now are the things that I want to be helpful with. You've already got a lot of this going in the right direction. I really appreciate the feedback from the affinity groups. Keep listening to them, except for about the bikes, which we'll talk about next. So thank you. Thank you, Chair Fall.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Milligan. And I am not seeing any additional comments. I just want to call on commissioners that haven't made any comments or questions this evening to make sure that we are hearing from you. So I'm going to go ahead and give you folks just a few more seconds here to, if you have a comment or suggestion, please put that into the chat window and I'll go ahead and call on you.
Fairfall, while we solicit additional comments from commissioners, I'd like to respond to a couple of comments and questions made about municipal parking and kind of additional efforts. The biggest barrier why cities don't do more municipal parking is the cost. So as an example, I previously worked with the city of Kirkland and we built Kirkland of all the small cities probably have a fairly expensive municipal parking program. They have their own parking garage that they coordinated with the development of the library in downtown Kirkland, as well as they have three of their own parking lots that they constructed throughout the downtown. And the most recent parking lot they constructed put together 65 parking stalls that cost $1 million. So, and that was just a flat surface parking lot. That wasn't even a parking structure. When you get into constructing a parking garage or large structure, the cost per parking stall reaches up to about $100,000 per stall. So that is the biggest barrier I think we have when it comes to municipal parking. I think the idea of getting investment from developers to go into a parking garage is a good one. I just wonder if it would be enough to pay for a parking garage or even a parking lot. And if we consider something like that, it might require additional public funding. So that's one of the major barriers that the city has always encountered when we've looked at trying to construct our own parking garage. Based on all your comments, I think we'll want to take a look at it again, but I just wanted to fill in that gap of why we haven't done it yet or why many cities don't do that.
Good comment, Planner Padua. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm not seeing any additional comments or questions. So with that, Kristen, are we in a conclusion at the moment?
I would double check with Stephen, but I believe so.
Yes, we are. I just wanted to quickly just share my screen just to show kind of what the next steps are for this project. Can you all see the presentation? Yes, okay. So with the next steps, where our plan is to start working through the code, and we're going to be meeting again with the affinity groups to talk about potential changes to kind of be going to code prior to bringing back this topic to the commission around June, depending on kind of how this process goes through the summer. So with that, I conclude the presentation.
Thank you. And I actually have two comments that just came in as you were discussing. So Commissioner Milligan, you have a comment.
Thank you. Yeah, I was following the rules and sticking with the topics. And I know I already said something about bikes, Commissioner Milligan here, but there was bikes, and then there was shared parking, which were the other topics that we were thinking we were separating out. And so there might be other commissioners who want to speak up about those, I think. Anyway, I want to +1 on Chair Fall's questions earlier about bike parking and my interpretation. I really love the Affinity Group's comments, except I think that they were not anticipating, not even recognizing the current need for bike parking. Yeah, sure, it seems like there's no problem with bike parking because nobody parks their bikes because there's no place to park your bike. I would love to ride a bike to many facilities if I knew I had a safe place to park them, and it needs to be a safe place. There must be something in the regulations that say you could put the bike parking off in the corner back in the dark over there where there's no traffic, for instance. My favorite place to put a bike is where there's a lot of visibility, a lot of eyes on the street for security. So if there's something like that that helps our bike parking requirements, but I think that is something we need to address and make sure that we have adequate attention to. Now I'm really done, but I want to thank the Affinity Groups for all the work they did because I really do agree on every single thing else they said except for bike parking. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. And Commissioner Brennan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. I was not quite sure about the rules on this one. So on the first few topics there, the consolidation, et cetera, and setting the kind of the metrics used for determining parking counts and creating a predictable set of metrics, that all makes a ton of sense. I think no debate about that in my mind. The transportation management plan, that's as Commissioner Morgan mentioned, it's about what's the value on the return on the investment of time and effort. It is tricky to provide oversight on those on an ongoing basis unless you've got an established program. They can be effective, but without that oversight, you kind of lose touch and they lose their effectiveness. But they are a tool that's used to do reductions in parking if you've got a transportation management plan. So that one, if there isn't an effective oversight program, then I would tend to agree that the effectiveness is limited. I think the idea of contextual requirements makes sense. It gets a little tricky. I think there's every project, some projects, let's say not every project, some projects offer a unique set of parking needs that aren't really well defined. And I think if the code doesn't already allow for an off-ramp or a deviation from standards using a parking study that's specific to the use, I think that should be considered as an alternative to deal with the uniqueness of certain projects and their parking needs. And then I totally agree with bikes. I mean, I think we've got to accommodate. We're moving toward multimodal, transportation systems. You've got to accommodate parking for cars, and that's big debate. Everybody's got an opinion about parking for cars, whether we need more or less, they're too big, they're too small, where they're located, on and on. Where do I plug my car in nowadays? But I think the idea for bikes is a growing need, and I think you need to be looking ahead and setting standards for bike parking. And then I agree with the shared parking, totally agree with that. One of the challenges is not just shared parking between properties, but when you think about an area as the downtown develops, like Park One. So you park in a location and you can go to multiple businesses, but you don't have to move your car every time you want to go to another business, which is the case in a lot of instances. So I think the city may not quite be there yet, but it is a concept that might be considered. And the idea of opening up your parking standards, that's a big project, as you know, and I understand why you're limiting the scope in this code update. Because that could be by itself, a fairly large piece of work. And like I said, everybody's got an opinion. So, and you'll hear from them. So anyway, I think great work on what you're advancing now. The pieces that you're advancing now, they seem to make sense to me. So thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Brennan. And Commissioner Lewis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Commissioner Joy Lewis here. Again, kind of addressing just this last bucket, I do think that it's important to call out that we really must account for the need for bike parking to be safe and visible right now. It's something that we have detailed in our policies. It's something our commission talks about a lot, but it worried me seeing the affinity groups. Their perspective on it is a little bit different than mine. So I'm going to agree with the previous commissioner's comments that we've had so far, and really want to voice that what I want to say is I'm going to appreciate you specifying to us how we're going to reinforce the policies we have with a prescriptive language. So I'm going to put that on you, Stephen. I know you're going to do a great job. And, whether it's something if developers say this is a little too onerous, and I think it's certainly applicable to say, well, the Parks Department has something that they like to put in for a fee. We'd be happy to give you the Issaquah treatment for you to pony up if you don't want to deal with it, right? And we can be able to and put our specific design standards, adding little benches, right? There's all kinds of things that we've talked about in the past of how we want to be able to integrate bike parking into our community. And I'm all too happy to take a larger fee from developers if they think it's just too much for them to take on. We would be happy to not only have that be enforced, but also to be able to create more of a livable space if they're not able to do that. So I have a hard time with the pushback of the concerns, because I think right now what we're finding is we're not getting what we need, and we need to be able to accelerate that. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lewis. Now I'm not seeing any additional new comments or questions. So I think from that, Planner Purdue, we could probably go ahead and call it. So with that, let's go ahead and move into reports. So, Kristen, do we have any new reports?
I don't have anything regarding the calendar and upcoming meetings. See, I think you get a break for a while. Congratulations. But I do have some council updates for you. So we have several agenda bills going to council on February 22nd. There are two from a Regional Coalition for Housing, or ARCH. One is regarding the general fund, and they're recommending a little over $3 million to go toward 5 different projects. And one of those projects is for 5 affordable units from Leo at the Trailhead TOD project. And then we have one, there's an interlocal agreement amendment with ARCH that's being made. And lastly, the docket that we had the public hearing on January 27th, that is also going to council on the 22nd. Most amendments or most city council updates, so I'm going to leave to Minnie Dollywall because she has attended quite a few recently.
Thanks, Kristen. So we had the council study session on Title 18 earlier last week or this week, on the 7th this week. We briefed them of all the good work that all the boards and commissions have been doing. Gave them links for all your meetings that you've done, all the agenda packets. So if they really want to know more, they have that resource. We shared with them the approach of having these 6 larger groups that you all are tackling, and proposed that after you have a public hearing on one group and deliberate on it, that we move that forward for council's discussion, so they can look at it, get familiar with it, discuss it, and give us any additional considerations they want the boards and commissions to look at if there are missing pieces in there. So that way they won't get everything all bundled up together, but as we go through each of those 6 topics, we would have a council discussion on those. So I think they were favorable to that. We'll be working on the details for when and how and all of that will work. Some feedback that they gave us, was related to public outreach. So the first topic, which is going out, we had our first open house on natural environment, which you'll be having a public hearing on the 24th. So that went well. I think they were supportive of having a place for folks to come in and get their questions answered before the public hearing. So we'll continue that same pattern with when you have a public hearing, we will have an open house for Q&A sessions where folks can come in and get, if they're confused about the content or have a question about it, we can help support that. Obviously, anyone can reach us regardless of the open house to get their questions answered. So that's the sort of discussion we had with council. And let me see what other feedback we heard from them. There was the concern about they're going to get the whole complete packet back in September, when they'll also be looking at budget at the time. So the timing concerns were expressed that we'll be working with them on. They were good with the Affinity session. One question came up was we are sending a postcard to everyone in the city, all property owners and residents, informing them of the land use code update and inviting them to the open house on March 8th. They had some feedback on including some additional language content in there, and so we've incorporated some of that in that design. So I think those were sort of the main things they were interested in, and I can but they appreciated all the work that all the boards and commissions have done. And we assured them that if you feel at some point you need more time, or that you have more questions for us, that we want to have that opportunity to let you reach out to us one-on-one. We can also set up some time with a few of you at a time, because as we get into the second phase, which is the code update, the content will get a little bit more technical. We want to make sure we break it down and not get inundate you with a lot of content. So that's what happened in the council study session. And upcoming meetings, I think Kristen kind of captured those that are happening on February 22nd. The rezone that you all have passed on, that is also scheduled for February 22nd. So they'll be making a decision on whether to put it on the docket or not. That's all I have. No more to report. Back to you, Kristen.
I have nothing else to report.
Okay. And thank you much, Kristen and Minnie. Okay, another business, no business announcements. We're good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and adjourn the meeting at 8:13.